All right, let's make sure my technology works. Yes, okay. I'm always nervous about plugging in my own computer, so just that this is working is a good sign. I just wanted to say I'm going to be talking about two of my favorite subjects today, which are systems thinking and participatory design. And I think many of you are probably familiar with it. And I'd like to kind of introduce some concepts that are oriented around combining these two things. As Nora mentioned, I work at Optimistic Design. We run an equity-centered design research and strategy consultancy. And this is my amazing team on the right up here. We're small but mighty. We're also short but mighty, but we're good. And I'm also a design educator. You can find me often teaching at University of Washington's Human-Centered Design and Engineering program. So I wrote a book that came out last year called Closing the Loop, Systems Thinking for Designers. And I felt like for me, it was filling a gap in what I felt like as a designer, I needed sort of a toolkit of systems thinking to navigate the complex spaces in which I was working, but I also still work as a designer. So even though I kind of studied systems thinking methodology, I felt like there is a really good intersection between both design and systems thinking. So I'm going to give a little bit of definition and how it relates to my work, as well as how it relates to what we think of as traditional processes, such as design thinking. Many of you might be familiar with this model. It's a 5-part design thinking process that was popularized by the Stanford D School and IDEO. And sometimes it's represented as a series of hexagons. But in this case, it's circular because it should be circular. And just to kind of sum it up, empathize is where you conduct design research to understand a user's context. Define is where you take that understanding and shift it into defining the problem space. Ideate is where you come up with ideas and potential solutions. And prototyping and testing, of course, is where you create maybe lo-fi, hi-fi prototypes, and then you test them. And I've been thinking a lot about the shortcomings of this process, particularly in the narrow way that we tend to apply it in user-centered design. We're usually thinking about the direct benefit of use to individual users. Just kind of think about your design processes. You're usually, especially if you're designing digital products, you're thinking about how somebody's going to be using a product in the moment and as an individual, and not really kind of thinking too much about the context beyond that. And in a world with increasing complexity, especially knowing that we are designing products and services, et cetera, at scale, I do feel like this approach falls short. So often in design thinking, what's missing is context, and that means taking a more expansive lens. I really like this quote from Eliel Saarinen, who is, famous 20th century designer or architect, and he said, "Always design a thing by thinking of its next larger context: a chair in a room in a house in an environment in a city plan." And on the right is a diagram, a little bit messy diagram from another 20th century designer, Charles Eames, in which these intersecting circles represent the interests of a client, the interests of a designer, and then that sort of bean-shaped thing is the interest of society. And he was kind of getting at the point that you need to be kind of serving all three of these interests. So jumping onto that idea, picture the design thinking process as a subset of a larger systems design process. And the design thinking process is a third circle that you see in this diagram. Before that, I've added expand, which means expanding your notion of the system beyond just your area of concern. And this includes understanding the status quo, the problems, and the way things work. And then this is then followed by imagine. How do you identify potential points of intervention in the system and ask yourself, are there different levels at which interventions can occur? Are there different leverage points? I really like that Karin and Jeffrey talked about leverage points. I was like, yeah, these things really align. And imagining interventions could include possibilities beyond the realm of user-centered design, such as policy, business models, services, or even long-term strategy. And lastly, after going through the design process, we have evaluate. So determining the impact of the change to the system, not just by measuring it, but being cognizant of the consequences. And the idea is that if you go through sort of similar steps, that this process is circular, but also that there's many different ways of potentially solving problems or intervening. And that's why there's a lot of circles that represent the design process. And some of these, and what's not represented here is that sometimes ideas, solutions, ways of navigating problems fall outside of the design process. It could be policy, it could be regulation, et cetera. And so what we call this in systems thinking is multi-finality. There's no one solution to something. And so kind of thinking about that through the lens of designer, you need to consider how do we look at problem spaces more broadly and not in just ways that we can solve. And going beyond this idea of expanding beyond design thinking, we need to consider system forces within the context of what's traditionally referred to as the problem space. So I think systems thinking for us as designers is encompassed in three kind of concepts. The first is interconnectedness, the second is causality, and the last is wholeness. And a metaphor that I really like that's related to this is just thinking about a forest. If you look at a forest, the roots are interconnected, the trees are communicating with each other and affecting each other. There's also causality. So this is what we might think of as the circle of life, where lots of things are interdependent and they have an impact on each other. And trees died, they became fertilizer for other species, et cetera. And so I think, and then lastly, wholeness. So kind of thinking about all of these different elements within a forest that affect each other. It's a system with many different stakeholders, and we can kind of think about our various forms of problem solving that way. It's essentially making the invisible visible, and that's kind of the mindset you can apply when you're using systems thinking. I think if there's some familiarity with systems thinking, and I think about systems thinking methodology, it's oftentimes viewed as a closed activity, meaning that maybe designers do some analysis and they kind of go off solo and kind of do some research to inform kind of a systems mapping exercise. Causal loop diagrams is a thing that we learn about. This is me and one of my team members a few years ago doing a systems thinking process. And I hate to say it, but this is an example of what my typical approach was, and this is an example of what an output might have been after that process, which is like, hey, it's kind of good analysis, but doing it in a closed way, it kind of, you start looking something like this when presenting this kind of abstract, complex information that feels unsynthesized. I don't know if y'all are familiar with crazy balls, but it's like, they're used a lot in police procedurals that are like this, where it's like a red yarn connecting all these different things. And sometimes I think these huge systems maps feel like this, and people are kind of looking at you. You look like this to them because your stakeholders are like, I don't understand what you're showing me. So I think it's truly up to us to collaborate with all stakeholders. It's not just those, who are decision making, but also those who are most marginalized or affected by the system. And not just conducting research with them, but co-creating with them as well as decision makers. So there's another issue with the design thinking process, and also, this very much overlaps. Maybe there are some nuances between design thinking and human-centered design, but they're essentially, at the end of the day, the same process. And there's a problem with this idea of designing for, I sometimes call it parachute design. So, you're kind of like going into a community and kind of designing for a community that's not yours. There are a lot of examples of this, but I kind of like some examples from, I don't know if most of you are probably familiar with the international style of architecture from the 20th century and the Bauhaus movement. This is a house from the Cité Frugez. I'm probably butchering that, sorry, French people. But it's a compound of worker housing designed by Le Corbusier in the 1920s. And, you know, these designers like Le Corbusier pushed the boundaries of architecture by prioritizing function, but it was a very top-down approach to design. And, you know, this kind of design ended up being really mimicked. And I love how the writer, Tom Wolfe, he wrote this essay called From Bauhaus to Our House. And he's a little obnoxious, but there are some truths in there. And he said, how did the workers like the worker housing? Oh, they complained, which was their nature at the stage of history. The poor creatures were frantically turning Le Corbusier's cool cubes inside out, trying to make them cozy and colorful. As Corbu himself said, they had to be re-educated to comprehend the beauty of the radiant city of the future. And there was no use consulting them directly, since, as Walter Gropius had pointed out, they were as yet intellectually undeveloped. So this is how designers kind of thought about their users or their audience in the 20th century. And this is still happening today. There's this designer, Chris Alawa, who wrote a series of articles on Medium called Stop Designing for Africa. And he discusses the failure of the EXO laptop, the laptops you're looking at here. It was a one laptop per child initiative from the early 2000s. And this initiative failed for a myriad of reasons. And one key reason was that the designers and distributors did not understand the context of ownership. Chris Alawa said, the EXO laptop was rejected by adults in African low-income economies because it focused on empowering one child as opposed to providing value to a family or entire community. Western biases played a role in the design development of this product. I once had an experience with a collaborator who was, you know, like, I work a lot in the US education system, and there are a lot of inequities in that system. And this other designer, he was from another country, and we were working on a US-based education program together that was focused on under-resourced schools and students. And I asked him about his experience working within this domain, just within this system. And he was like, you know what, I don't need to know anything about this domain. I just come in with human-centered design. I'm an expert in that, and I can therefore, you know, help come up with solutions in that space. And I was kind of like, wow, this is super arrogant, and I don't know if, like, that's the way you should be projecting design. Again, that's something you might refer to as parachute design. And I don't think it's like a good approach to kind of designing in the complex world we have. I love that Arati talked about positionality, and I was like, yes, go girl, because I'm about to talk about positionality too. Designers need to recognize their positionality, and that means kind of understanding who you are in terms of not just your identity, but your proximity to power and privilege. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And you know, who you are in relation to others. Sasha Cassandra points out, and she wrote Design Justice, which is a really great book. Design justice practitioners flip the problem how to ensure community participation in a design process on its head to ask instead how design can best be used as a tool to amplify, support, and extend existing community-based processes. And I'll talk about this a little later too. One thing that we should acknowledge is that many of us are weird. So yeah, my kids think I'm weird, like in the way you might think the word weird works. But there's also this acronym WEIRD that the Harvard professor Joseph Henrich wrote a book about, which is Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And this is often what encompasses a lot of us who are tasked with problem solving in our world today. And once you start kind of thinking about this, even if you have one letter missing, what it still represents is a type of privilege that many of us in the room have. And you can see how problematic projects like one laptop per child and, you know, kind of the approach of my former design collaborator that I talked about. So a criticism of one laptop per child, for example, is that the very framing of the need for personalized productivity, digital technology, is that it's necessary at all. And that by itself is framed in a really Western way. And so, you know, one of my tenets as a design researcher is just always question the framing. And so that's something we need to continuously consider as designers. So what you're looking at here is an example of a power and positionality wheel. It shows one's proximity to power using a sociocultural lens. I'll caveat that the one you're looking at right here is through a North American lens, but there are different versions of this that exist for different sociocultural contexts. And as you're working on your projects, consider the most marginalized of your users. Who sits the furthest out when it comes to power? So for example, I do a lot of work, as I mentioned before, in US-based education, and so I have to think about those who are least served in today's systems. And in the US, it's children of immigrants, Black and Latino children, and children experiencing poverty. And now what you do is you kind of think about where you sit on this wheel versus the most marginalized of those who are considered end users or end beneficiaries of your design solutions. And this is what it means to start noticing and reflecting on your own biases, power, and privilege. It's really a question of historically who holds power versus those who don't, and trying to change and shift that in your work. And this also can kind of manifest sometimes as unconscious bias. I was thinking about this story the other day where I was at a design happy hour function, and I met this person, and he was recommending an article to me on design and creativity, and I was like, oh, yeah, could you look at? I would love to read it. And then he pulled it up, and I had written it, and I was like, I wrote that article, and he was like, It did not, it kind of exploded his mind a little bit. I think he thought a man wrote it or something, and he just could not connect that I wrote it. He kept telling me, oh, well, you should read it. And I was just like, I can't even talk to this person. he can't even fathom that someone who looks like me might write an article like that he was recommending to someone else. So it's just that sort of thing happens, right, to people who maybe have unearned privilege. He had some levels of unearned privilege where he was kind of associating people who have expertise with somebody who might look like him. And we do this all the time with our end users, and this is why I call, kind of our research participants when we work with them, and we don't even just conduct research with them or those who are doing co-design with. We refer to them as lived experts because they have expertise that they bring to the table and expertise that needs to be acknowledged. This approach manifests in modifications to the traditional design thinking process. So this is, in the US, the National Equity Project created this equity-centered design framework, adding inquire and imagine, rather than ideate, to ensure involvement with community stakeholders. Also, notice and reflect are about understanding your power, as I mentioned before, your power and positionality as a designer. So once we understand our positionality, we need to engage in a more participatory form of design. We often call this co-design, and Karin and Jeffrey gave a really nice definition of what it means to co-design. I think the problem with the term co-design is it's been co-opted by those who are just describing user feedback. So for example, I was recently at South by Southwest, and I went to a happy hour for an organization that describes their core work as co-design, and it turns out they were just a user testing organization. They would just be like, we can find users, and you can run usability tests, and I was just kind of like, that's not co-design. But I was just like, okay, I can't really be this lone voice in my little soapbox at a happy hour. So I didn't challenge it, but this comes up all the time where, I have clients who say, we want to do co-design, and really what they're talking about is I want to test our products with maybe some students or something. And that's totally different than what co-design actually is. So I'll kind of describe what it is or what it should be as aspirational. It means shifting power to lived experts, not just extracting their context and stories. So you don't just go and interview them about their pain points and then boom, you just F off and they never hear from you again. That is not a feedback loop in terms of, helping understand what kind of expertise they bring to the table. It's also involving lived experts in ideation and design, not just interviewing and testing. It's sharing design expertise by training lived experts in design processes and methods. And sort of opposite of that is deferring to methods and processes that lived experts bring to the table. What it isn't is interviewing and giving research participants a gift card, running usability tests with end users, sending out a survey to end users, or running a focus group to get feedback on an idea or prototypes. And so it's just like one of those things that, you know, I nitpick a little bit, but I think it's really important in our industry, especially as we are talking about concepts like shifting power and equity. Often designers do not want to cede power to non-designers. I might be showing my age here, but this is from an episode of The Simpsons where Homer Simpson designs a car, and because the car he designed was so awful, the company went bankrupt. And it's like, and it was also so expensive to make that he totally drove the company out of business. And it's funny because, you know, I had a boss who had a model of this that kind of sat on his desk. And I was kind of like, oh, this is kind of upheld by designers sometimes as an example of why end users shouldn't design things. And it's, I don't know, it just feels like maybe 20 years ago it didn't feel arrogant to be thinking or, you know, saying that. But I think when we think and say that, we end up sounding a little bit like Le Corbusier and saying like, oh, people just need to be re-educated. Like, I hold a lot of expertise as a designer, so people can't design their own things. But I think at the end of the day, they can't. Like, it just means designers ceding power. And what that looks like is design moves then from producing to facilitating to then ceding power. And as NYU professor Natasha Iskander has said, design thinking privileges the designer above the people she serves, and in doing so, limits the scope for truly innovative ideas and makes it hard to solve challenges that are characterized by a high degree of uncertainty, like climate change. Like, we can't just hoard the power in making decisions about these really complex problem spaces. Again, I'm just like, love that, I'm just like referring to the previous talks basically, but another thing that Karen and Jeffrey talked about was design as facilitation. And I want to push it a little bit further from facilitation even, and inspired by Victor Ulloa's radical participatory design philosophy, we need to start moving towards a position of support, particularly when it comes to designing with communities. So whether it's citizens, students, patients, healthcare workers, just to name a few. And what that means is we don't facilitate the experience anymore because we can kind of train people in order to facilitate their own experiences. And they can actually reject our processes if they want. So radical participatory design is kind of an interesting concept. I don't see it happening that often, but it is something that I feel like we need to better strive for, including my own practice. So putting systems thinking and participatory design together, I love this concept called the participative principle. Mike Jackson entered a system of system methodologies, and this is like written years ago, like maybe in the 1980s or something. And he said, if possible, all the stakeholders should participate in the various phases of the process. Stakeholders here include representatives of the purposeful parts of the system and of the larger system. And then he also goes further by saying you should engage stakeholders like lived experts in designing for the future. The idealized future is a statement of the system the planners and stakeholders would create if they were free to create any system they wanted. If pursued positively, it can lead to the interests of the different parts of the organization itself, and of the wider society being reconciled. And I want to point out that idea of the wider society being reconciled, because if you're involving the right stakeholders within this process, you're also involving those who are most marginalized in this, today's systems. And so it's not just decision makers or people who have the power or the money to make change, it's also involving those who typically don't have the power to make change. So by taking a participative approach, by adhering to this principle, you can achieve greater impact. And I'll walk through 3 ways this approach can increase impact. It can inspire innovation, it can lead to more equitable outcomes, and it also accounts for systemic forces. So first, the participative, okay, I'm gonna say this like 10 times and not get it right. The participative principle can inspire innovation. I'm going to share an example from my friend Chris McCarthy's work with Kaiser Permanente. He currently runs a consultancy called ILN in the States that's focused on healthcare. He's an expert in participatory design and human-centered design, and he led a participatory design project to address the problem of errors when administering administration in hospital environments. A 1999 study pointed out that medication errors were causing measurable harm to 1.5 million people a year, costing $3.5 billion in additional treatment for resulting injuries and leading to some 7,000 preventable deaths. For the hospital system in which Chris worked, the process of medication administration held huge risks, and it's a risk they wanted to mitigate. So they used participatory design process with nurses to address the risks and problems when administering medication. And Chris and his team found that, for example, one nurse was interrupted 17 times during a single medication pass. So when they collaborated during a series of workshops, they first tried to understand how nurses felt, and the sketch on the left was typical of different nurses' sentiment, where the hair is standing on end, they're stressed out, they're unhappy, it's like just a super stressful job. They're afraid of making mistakes. And then the nurses went on to prototype different ideas about how to potentially solve for things like distraction and interruption. And one nurse prototyped a sign, this is the image in the middle, on her body that says, "Leave me alone." And it was a funny moment during the workshop, but then they started figuring out how to make this real so they can test in a real hospital. After 5 rounds of design and learning, at each step, involving nurses to kind of make the change. They had the design on the right, which was a lighting system that communicated different states of focus. So I'm not going to explain too much of what this chart is showing, but it's basically the success of medication passes after using like a 5-step system involving things like the, the SASH system, or the SASH alert product. And in this case, having the community of nurses convey ideas eventually became solutions, not only led to innovative ideas, but actually had impact by reducing the errors in medication administration. And this feels like the opposite of Homer Simpson's car, where it's like, if you involve folks in the right way and you actually empower them to kind of do the work, you can push your thinking even further and create, more innovation that we didn't even think of in the closed walls of our kind of design thinking minds. Next, the participant principle can lead to more equitable outcomes. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this quote, "The future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed." And the correction of these kinds of current inequities requires systemic change. I keep thinking, for example, these are just like a bunch of headlines about AI and the moment we're in, and it can either drive further existing inequalities or can be meaningfully developed to make to have a part in closing equality gaps. So we as designers are in a position to set this direction. I mean, there's a lot of despair, I think, in our industry about the potential impact of AI, and it's really hard to hear people saying like, oh, it's just like, it's inevitable. It's like a runaway train, the way it's happening. I really liked this paper that I had read, like the headline of it is in the upper right-hand corner, Navigating the Promise and Peril of AI for Students of Color. I like how that's phrased. It's like there is promise, there is also peril. And we have to be able to kind of like navigate that as designers and try to find ways in order to focus on how do we identify the peril and how do we design for the promise. A good example of how to be inclusive and participatory in developing technology is Project Latimer, which is an AI platform. It's a large language model developed with diverse communities, particularly with and for historically Black colleges and universities in the US. And it acknowledges that the most prominent LLMs are particularly biased against minorities, and we therefore need alternatives that are inclusive and transparent. It's named after Lewis Latimer, who I'm sure many of us don't know. He actually was he was an inventor from the early 20th century, and he actually worked with Alexander Graham Bell to invent the first telephone. He then went on to work with Thomas Edison to invent a way of manufacturing filaments for light bulbs. Light bulbs basically worked the way they did because of his work. And because he was a Black American, many people have never even heard of him. But I think many of us have heard of Alexander Graham Bell, as well as Thomas Edison. And so Project Latimer actually includes a lot of history that has been erased. So when you ask the Latimer AI model certain questions, it'll answer them very differently than, say, ChatGPT would. It's definitely worth playing with, because I think it's a good example of how diverse communities can design for themselves, with themselves in mind, to prevent the harm that is usually foisted upon them by those with privilege. Lastly, the participative principle accounts for systemic forces. Again, let's go. I love the example of one laptop per child. It's just like the biggest, I don't know, hubris project of the early 2000s. They did not account for systemic forces, not just from the community perspective, but also from the technology and economy perspectives. So one framework that I really like using in my work, and that I recommend all designers use in their work, is the STEEP framework. And it's kind of thinking about things through these 5 lenses: sociocultural, technological, environmental, economic, and political. So in the one laptop per child example, they did not take into account these various competing factors and how they would contribute to their ability to design, develop, and deploy such a complex, scaled-up system of distribution and use. And then, of course, I had mentioned earlier, they did not at all take into consideration the sociocultural issues with doing something like this. So when you're analyzing problem space, you can think of various factors in the STEEP framework. Remember the crazy systems mapping? So I lied. I didn't stop doing systems mapping, but my team and I now do it with stakeholders. So in this example, we even do it with students. This is an education project, and we work together with students to create ecosystem maps of their support system. And this later informed potential investments by a philanthropy focused on improving student support. And doing this helps us better understand systemic forces with lots of different stakeholders, including those who are funding the work. Similar work manifested in a project I did with the Gates Foundation's U.S. Programs Education team, where lived experts informed an investment strategy around how to fix the subject of Algebra 1, which in the U.S. is a crucial subject for educational success. And it's either a gateway or gatekeeper course. And for Black and Latino students, it's a gatekeeper for a broad number of just discriminatory reasons that are the fault of the system and not the fault of the students. And it's interesting, like our stakeholders went into the process sort of hypothesizing that there were specific, mainly digital products that could help solve for this. But after engaging with ideation with lived experts, so students and teachers from under-resourced communities, and those on my team from those communities, which, by the way, one thing I haven't really talked about is representation, but there really should be representation on your team, especially if you're kind of doing this kind of participatory design work with others. And they realized that there were many avenues that needed to be pursued, including better support systems, changing teacher practices, and reimagining tests and assessments. And we're really lucky to be working with a philanthropy team that was really open to these ideas and taking these incremental approaches. So focusing on equity through participation allowed for a more holistic view of potential change. So to sum up, our ability to have an impact as designers increases by taking a participative approach. It can inspire innovation, it can lead to more equitable outcomes, and it also accounts for systemic forces. Systemic change is necessary. Dr. Bettina Love, who writes about educational freedom, coined the term freedom dreaming, and is dreaming about a system that is free from today's oppression. And I think that what we need to do when we adopt a system thinking and participatory mindset is that working with diverse stakeholders to dream about and move the needle towards systemic change is an important step in our process. Thank you. If you're interested in purchasing my book, there's actually a discount code if you go up to my publisher site, but feel free to connect with me as well. So thank you for having me.